the beginning, a boy walked out of a shop, announcing he was heading out. Staff members thanked him for working so hard and addressed him by his name, Samura. He bolted forward, knowing he couldn't waste any time. Today marked the moment he'd been counting down to for weeks. His heart raced as he sprinted through the streets, and he couldn't stop thinking about one thing: a girl. She had short silver hair that caught the light beautifully, and her eyes slanted upward in a way that made her seem cool and distant. Inside a nearby store, Samura's expression lit up with excitement. He'd found exactly what he was searching for. Grinning widely, he held up the merchandise and whispered that it was Sech-chan's character goods. In his mind, he knew that Simata was a character from the hottest romance comedy manga currently sweeping the nation, a series called Ajama. The story had gripped him from the start. The main character, Yuichi, had fallen hard for the heroine Sho after meeting her in high school. But there was a twist. Yuichi's wealthy childhood friend, Kaori, also harbored feelings for him, and she wielded her family's power to sabotage their relationship constantly. He remembered how the manga captivated readers with its mix of characters. Sho growing closer to Yuichi, the conniving Kaori scheming to win him over, and countless others creating an entertaining, dramatic love triangle. The delicate balance of affection and conflict had earned widespread praise. In typical romance manga fashion, he knew there were always supporting female characters alongside the main heroine. One of those characters was his favorite, Simata, Sho's closest friend, often called the losing heroine because she wouldn't end up with the main character. Later, Samura walked down the street, lost in thought about how most readers probably fell in love with one of the main heroines and rallied behind her, holding their breath to see who'd ultimately win. He clutched the merchandise against his chest and smiled, though he quickly caught himself. He didn't want anyone seeing him grin like a foolish fan. He stuffed it into his bag and spoke happily about how the anime adaptation had brought so much new merchandise. Suddenly, as he turned his head, his stomach dropped. A truck barreled straight toward him, and his mind screamed in terror. Was this really how he'd die? He saw the massive vehicle heading his way and realized he was on the sidewalk. The driver must have fallen asleep at the wheel. Everything seemed to move in slow motion now. He desperately wished he wasn't about to die. He'd never see the end of Ajama. Deep down, he knew Sech-chan's love would go unrequited. He was just a high school student with so much left to experience, so many stories left to follow. There were countless things he wanted to do and discover in his future. The truck struck him hard, and the world went black. The boy jolted awake, confused and disoriented. He touched his face as his eyes fluttered open, groaning that his head felt incredibly heavy. What was happening? He found himself walking through a school hallway, bewildered about where he was. This didn't look like his school at all. He examined his uniform and realized it was completely different from what he wore back home. When he touched his body, the memory hit him. A truck had just hit him. His expression twisted in fear and confusion. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. What on earth was going on? Maybe the truck crash had sent him into a coma, and this was all just a dream playing out in his mind. From a nearby room, Hisamura heard voices talking about Sech-chan. Another voice mentioned that Sho kept hesitating about something. His face went pale as he recognized those voices. They belonged to people he'd heard countless times in audio dramas tied to the manga. He realized with growing shock that these were Sho Fuji and Simata from Ajama. Through the open door, he heard Sho saying that Yuichi definitely needed both of them by his side, and she worried she'd just be a nuisance to them. Hisamura couldn't believe what he was witnessing with his own eyes. Simata responded that it had nothing to do with Tojo, and that what truly mattered was how Sho felt inside. Sho asked what she meant, and Hisamura recognized this exact scene. It was where Sho was wrestling with whether to accept Yuichi's date invitation. Watching from the doorway with his heart pounding, he understood the scene perfectly. Yuichi had asked her out, but since his childhood friend Kaori was so possessive, Sho was second-guessing herself. The person encouraging Sho to make a brave choice was none other than Simata herself. She asked directly whether Sho loved Yuichi, and Sho replied with certainty, yes. Simata cheered her on, insisting that if Yuichi was asking her to go on a date, it absolutely meant he cared about her. Sho nodded in agreement, thanked Simata for talking to her, and ran off with newfound determination. Simata called out to encourage her as she left. Hisamura heard Sho's voice fade as she spoke to herself, pumping herself up to do her best. This was his favorite moment from the entire series. The scene that had made him fall in love with Simata in the first place. With tears threatening to spill, he thought about how Sech-chan harbored her own crush on the main character. At first, Simata had found Sho's constant interaction with Yuichi annoying, but over time and through countless shared moments, she developed real feelings for him. Yet she also knew without question that Sho loved Yuichi too. That's why Simata had chosen to be their biggest supporter, pushing Sho and Yuichi together even though it cost her dearly. Seeing this scene played out, Hisamura realized she'd forced her own emotions to stay buried inside her heart. That was exactly why he'd fallen in love with her, because she could be genuinely happy for her friend, even at the cost of her own heart. Simata suddenly turned around and asked who was there, pulling open the door to reveal the boy. She called him Hisamura and asked if he'd overheard their conversation. Hisamura froze, shocked to find Simata standing right in front of him. He apologized, saying he hadn't meant to listen in, but then confusion washed over him. Why had she called him by that name? He hadn't seen this exact scene play out in the original story, yet the words that suddenly came from his mouth were straight from the manga itself. In disbelief, he wondered if he'd somehow become Tsukasa Hisamura. He recalled who this character was. Tsukasa Hisamura appeared in Ajama as a reliable friend of the main character, Yuichi. This character always worked to lighten the mood whenever Yuichi felt trapped in his love triangle, and he offered genuine advice when things got serious. He was crucial to the story, but stayed completely uninvolved in the romantic drama. Hisamura was stunned. They shared the exact same first and last name, and their bodies and voices were eerily similar too. Tsukasa was actually one of his favorite characters, though he insisted he wasn't doing an impression. Still, even if this was just a dream, how lucky could he be? He was witnessing his favorite scene from a front row seat, and his best girl had even called out his name directly. He found himself speaking lines again, asking Sho if she was truly comfortable with this situation, given that Simata was also attracted to Yuichi. Hisamura felt shock at his own words. He was speaking on his own again. Would this keep happening until the story ended? Simata gave him a sad smile and said this was fine because she'd already confirmed whether Yuichi and Sho matched well together. With genuine warmth, she added that she didn't fit between them. They were a match made in destiny. Hisamura's face turned red, and he stared at Simata's beautiful, caring expression. Her smile made him fall for her all over again, but that very same smile was the one that broke her own heart. He clenched his fists tightly and thought about how he couldn't stand seeing her wear such a painful expression just because she loved the main character. Right then and there, he decided to change the story where she remained unhappy. He confessed to her with intensity, telling her he loved her and begging her to give him a chance. His face blazed with embarrassment as he spoke. He thought about how true happiness for the character you adored was the ultimate reward for devoted fans like himself. Simata's eyes widened in surprise, her cheeks flushing bright red. Hisamura continued passionately, saying he loved her kindness toward her friends most of all, and he really admired how cool Sech-chan looked. Her short silver hair made her appear both strong and beautiful at the same time. Simata turned crimson, flustered, and told him to wait. She pointed out that calling her Sech-chan was something he'd never done before. She emphasized that Hisamura had never addressed her that way, until this very moment. Hisamura felt his heart race as he realized how adorable she looked when embarrassed. This dream had just become the greatest gift ever because she'd felt like an untouchable character before. Now they were having a real conversation, and he could even tell her exactly how he felt. Believing this was his only real shot, Hisamura prepared to pour out everything. He continued enthusiastically that he loved her gentleness, how much she cared about Sho, and that she'd even researched Yuichi to help her friend. He kept talking about how charming it was that she'd fallen for someone over time. It made her easy to understand, but incredibly cute too. Most of all, he loved how she sacrificed her own feelings for her friend's sake. Simata blushed intensely, asking if he was trying to make her angry. His expression darkened as he replied that he hated seeing her do that to herself. Simata reacted with shock, listening as he insisted she needed to find her own happiness. Still flushed, she said she didn't want to hear such things from him. Hisamura stepped closer, declaring that was exactly why he'd make her happy. Simata's face reddened further in surprise. Hisamura repeated his confession with absolute seriousness. He loved her, he would definitely make her happy, and he wanted her to be his girlfriend. Simata stood frozen, blushing deeply. Hisamura reflected on how Simata was the losing heroine in Ajama, and since the manga wasn't finished, the story would continue onward. He understood that Simata's love would stay unreciprocated as long as the plot followed its original path, but he desperately wanted her to find happiness. He truly didn't care what happened to Tsukasa Hisamura's character if it meant she could smile again. He couldn't bear to see her heartbroken smile or her suffering anymore. Simata shook with emotion and asked loudly if he was being serious about dating her. Hisamura answered with total conviction that of course he was. He'd even sacrifice everything for her. In his heart, he admitted he was a hopeless fan who'd spent all his money on her merchandise. Simata blushed heavily and asked him to slow down, wondering aloud if this was really how he naturally acted. She stepped backward nervously as Hisamura told her that Sech-chan was responsible for turning him into this devoted person. Simata panicked, saying he was scaring her by talking like that. Suddenly, she lost her footing and stumbled. Hisamura shouted a warning, and there was a loud clatter as he caught her with one arm, pulling her against his chest. Their heartbeats thundered loudly, and their faces were dangerously close. Hisamura apologized nervously while Simata told him it was okay. Sweating and turning crimson, Hisamura marveled at how close she was. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body, and he could see every delicate eyelash framing her large, round eyes. Simata found herself blushing as she hoped this moment would never end. Hisamura, thinking this was just a dream anyway, wondered if he could be a bit bolder. He asked what her answer was to his confession. Simata, caught off guard, asked what he meant. Hisamura clarified that he wanted to know her response to what he'd just declared. Simata, embarrassed, suggested they could discuss her answer at a better time. Hisamura refused, insisting he needed to know right now. Simata blushed deeply and complained that he was standing too close. Hisamura asked if her hesitation meant no, and he thought that since this was a dream, rejection wouldn't hurt as much, but he'd regret it forever if he woke up without knowing her true feelings. He told her firmly he wouldn't release her until she gave him an answer. Simata, hiding her flushed face, grumbled that he was being difficult and asked if he'd always been this pushy. Hisamura asked what she thought about his proposal. He wanted to know if it was okay for him to become her boyfriend. Simata continued blushing intensely, avoiding his gaze, and admitted that she thought he was genuinely kind and that becoming his girlfriend wasn't completely impossible. Hisamura pressed further, asking if she was willing to date him and be his girlfriend officially. Simata's face turned an even deeper shade of red as she stammered. Finally, she pushed him away forcefully and shouted that she couldn't do this. She bolted from the classroom, declaring she was going home. Hisamura collapsed to the floor in frustration, realizing she'd run away. He stood up and decided he absolutely had to make his feelings clear to her. He threw open the classroom door and yelled after her that he was serious and his love for her would never change, no matter what happened. He figured that even if he woke up right now and returned to his real world, she needed to hear this. When Simata turned around, Hisamura shouted with all his heart that he loved her so intensely and would absolutely make her happy. Simata's expression shifted to pure shock as she blushed. Hisamura promised himself that he'd always support her from here on out. Simata pointed at him while blushing furiously and demanded to know what he was saying so loudly, telling him to keep it down so she could think about his confession properly. She ran away, still flushed. Hisamura admitted he hadn't gotten a definitive answer, but he thought Simata looked incredibly cute when flustered. He smiled to himself, picked up his belongings, and decided it was time to head home for now. Then he paused and wondered when he'd finally wake up. He questioned where he should even return to before suddenly dropping everything in alarm as he wondered if he was actually waking up right then. The scene shifted, and silver hair came into view. Hisamura thought it looked like her short locks. Some girls nearby greeted her cheerfully, and Hisamura noticed Simata was taller than most girls her age. She responded casually to their greeting, and Hisamura thought she was different from typical manga heroines who were cute and small with long hair. Behind her, someone called out Sech-chan, and it turned out to be Sho. Hisamura observed that Sho was like a beautiful best friend to Simata. Sho greeted Simata with a warm smile, which Simata returned gladly. Sho reminded Simata that she'd texted her about it online yesterday, explaining how grateful she was that Simata had helped her get a date with Yuichi. Simata brushed it off, saying she hadn't really done much. Sho had worked incredibly hard for it herself. Simata reflected that all she'd done was look into rumors about Yuichi. The story went that Yuichi supposedly had a childhood fiancé, but when Simata investigated, she discovered this was completely false. Her only real contribution was giving Sho the encouragement she needed not to give up on her crush. The way Sho and Yuichi felt about each other seemed almost magical, like reading a beautiful manga unfold in real life. Simata wanted to support her best friend's first love with everything she had. Then Simata's thoughts drifted to Hisamura's face, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Sho noticed and asked if something had happened to Simata yesterday. Simata blushed again, and Sho pointed out that her reaction made it obvious something was up. Sho mentioned that Simata usually replied quickly to texts online, but she'd been slow responding yesterday, so something was definitely different. Simata, with a red face, apologized for that too. Sho studied her expression carefully and speculated whether someone had confessed their feelings to her. Simata's blush intensified dramatically, and Sho insisted that she could read Simata's face like an open book and demanded to hear everything. Simata called out Sho's name in embarrassment. The scene shifted to the girls' bathroom, where Sho spoke with surprise, saying Hisamura Khan's full name and remarking that she understood now. She admitted she'd noticed that Simata and Hisamura had been talking a lot lately. Simata blushed uncomfortably. Sho then asked directly if Simata would go out with him. Simata replied that she still hadn't given him an answer. Sho looked surprised and asked why not. Simata, still blushing, explained that she couldn't just say yes simply because he'd confessed to her. Sho then asked if Simata liked someone else romantically. Simata hesitated at the question and thought to herself that Yuichi should have been the first person that came to mind. Despite his clumsiness, she'd caught feelings for him without realizing it after witnessing how single-mindedly he loved Sho. But the person who actually came to her mind was. She stopped herself, blushing hard, and quickly insisted she didn't have anyone else on her mind. Sho smiled and said she understood, but then asked how Simata had felt when Hisamura confessed to her. Simata admitted while turning red that she'd felt genuinely happy. She reflected that she'd always assumed she wasn't built for romance. But when Hisamura, someone who also cherished his friends the way she did, poured out such passionate feelings, it had felt like a fairy tale moment. There was absolutely no way she wouldn't feel thrilled. She thought about Hisamura's face again and blushed, scolding herself for remembering something she shouldn't. She realized it was because Hisamura had spoken those shoujo manga lines so naturally that she couldn't possibly forget them. Sho laughed and said Simata was too cute for words. Sho told her it wasn't a bad idea to take some time and think things through carefully. That was much more like Simata anyway. Simata asked if Sho was making fun of her. Sho stepped out of the bathroom and explained that she was genuinely happy to finally be able to talk about matters of the heart with Simata. Sho added that she planned to confess her feelings during her date and even suggested that if things went well, they could go on a double date together. Watching Sho's joyful smile, Simata realized that hearing about Yuichi from Sho no longer caused her pain. Perhaps her feelings for Yuichi had been quietly suppressed all along because of Sho's presence. Simata remarked that Sho was always rushing ahead, and the two of them walked away together. Simata thought to herself that she felt completely swept away by Hisamura's confession. The scene shifted to Hisamura's house, where he lay in bed with an unreadable expression. He thought it was strange. He should have woken up in the real world by now after sleeping for one whole day. As he came downstairs with a yawn, he realized something disturbing. He seemed to be stuck in the manga world permanently. In his dream, he'd watched himself act as a character with the identical name as his own, Tsukasa Hisamura. Then somehow his body had started moving of its own accord. He'd managed to find his way to his house, eaten dinner, and everything had tasted incredibly real. It all felt too authentic to be just a dream. He concluded that entering a manga's actual world should be impossible under any circumstances. While washing his face, Hisamura thought about how realistic the water felt, how genuine the sensation was, and how clearly he could see his reflection. As he got dressed, he realized that by yesterday evening, the memories of Tsukasa Hisamura had become mixed with his own. He wondered seriously if he'd actually died when the truck hit him. If he'd completely transformed into Tsukasa Hisamura permanently, then returning to his previous world was no longer possible. He accepted that he'd have no choice but to live in this new world from now on. He felt the weight of what he'd lost. His previous family and friends remained in that distant world. Under normal circumstances, he'd be consumed with regret and grief. But as he opened his closet and knelt down, he suddenly shouted in his mind about his earlier actions. He'd thought this was a dream, so he'd confessed to Shimada. He regretted acting so carelessly. He questioned himself about the exact words he'd spoken. "I'll make you happy, and I'll never let you go." He felt ashamed for getting so carried away and worried that Shimada probably thought he was disgusting. What if she hated him now? He imagined her telling him that even though he'd helped her before, suddenly hugging and confessing over and over was gross, and that she wanted him to stay far away from her. Tears streamed down his face as Hisamura wondered if he'd ever get another chance. He desperately wished he could rewind time to before he'd entered this world. He groaned that even though he'd gotten the opportunity to finally speak with Shimada, he regretted how he'd done it. Crying, he admitted that even if he wanted to pretend none of it happened, running into her at school would definitely be awkward. As he performed a yoga pose in despair, he shouted asking what on earth he should do now. Then the door opened, and someone pointed out that he'd been making a ruckus for a while. While he was still stretched out on the floor, the voice reminded him that he'd be late for school if he didn't get moving. Hisamura replied that he understood and called the person Ria. He thought to himself that there was indeed another supporting heroine he hadn't considered. Ria handed him his lunch box and called him Oni-chan. Hisamura recognized her as Ria Hisamura, Tsukasa Hisamura's younger sister. He thanked her for always taking care of him. Ria looked confused and asked what he was talking about. Hisamura, while still crying a bit, told her he was grateful to have such an adorable little sister. Ria, alarmed, asked what he meant. Hisamura thought about how Ria Hisamura was another supporting heroine in Ajama's cast. Ria ranked among the most beloved characters in popularity polls, and he'd definitely been a fan of hers too. But now that he carried the memories of Tsukasa Hisamura, she felt less like a character he adored, and more like a precious little sister he genuinely cherished. Ria asked what was wrong with him, and Hisamura was pretty sure that Ria was confirmed to be another losing heroine in the original story, which only made him wish harder for her happiness. He reached out and patted her head gently, causing her to react with surprise. Hisamura smiled warmly and told her she was adorable and he was certain she'd find her own happiness someday. Ria blushed and asked what had gotten into him. She stood up and told him to quit being silly because they needed to leave for school right now. Hisamura agreed and told her not to be angry. Ria, with a pouting expression, said she wasn't actually mad. Hisamura thought to himself that his little sister truly was very sweet, and she was just hiding her embarrassment behind that angry act, exactly like in the manga. He understood that alongside these new memories, his emotions would gradually adapt to this world. As they walked together, Hisamura thought that he'd be dishonest if he said he felt zero regret about his previous life. But right now, what mattered most was his little sister, and most importantly, facing his confession to Shimada with genuine sincerity. He promised himself he'd never let that moment become his greatest source of shame. When they reached school, he told Ria to do her best. Ria told him to do his best as well. Hisamura then noticed someone and recognized him immediately. His eyes brightened as he walked over and greeted him as Yuichi while grabbing his shoulder. Yuichi looked startled, and Hisamura realized he just greeted him like they were actual childhood best friends. He thought about how this was the MC Yuichi Shijimoto. Yuichi responded with Hisamura's name, Tsukasa. Hisamura noticed that unlike typical romance manga protagonists, Yuichi was quite tall and popular, known for playing basketball. However, Hisamura detected that Yuichi looked somewhat tired, like he'd seen something terrifying. Hisamura asked what was bothering him and pointed out that Yuichi appeared scared. Yuichi suddenly grabbed Hisamura's shoulder with desperation and begged him to help, calling it his once-in-a-lifetime request. Hisamura, shocked, could only think of one word: